All right, good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes.
Hi, Eleanor.
Hey, Becky.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our virtual talk. A few housekeeping things. We do ask that you please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. Our speaker will be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the chat function. We'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the program as well. Please note that this talk is recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the once the talk is over. If you would like to rewatch this talk or previous talks, please check our Facebook page. And I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Eleanor, who is a docent with the Timken. She's going to give an amazing lecture today, and I will go ahead and hand it on over to Eleanor.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. I'll get the frogs out. Well, greetings and welcome to today's virtual tour with the Timken Museum. My name is Eleanor, and I'm a docent with the museum and delighted to be with you for today's presentation entitled Rembrandt and His Colleagues. And I'll be taking a look primarily at the works in Timken's Dutch and Flemish gallery, but also a few related works. So a bit of historical background will help set the stage for understanding the art and artists of this time period. In the 17th century, the Netherlands existed as two countries, the Northern Netherlands and the Southern Netherlands. The Southern Netherlands was a Catholic country under the rule of the Spanish Habsburgs. Its people were referred to as Flemish, which derives from Flanders, its richest and most important county. Artists from the Spanish Netherlands generally painted in the Baroque style, and this was characterized by drama, rich, deep color, and intense light and dark shadows. So, for example, Flemish art is personified by Rubens, and it was luxurious, courtly, and very often religious. Now, we find quite a different story in the North. The 17th century in the North was a unique era of political, economic, and cultural greatness, during which the newly minted country of Holland ranked among the most powerful and influential in Europe and the world. And it erupted with artists of such skill and inventiveness, they continue to enthrall us to this day. So what accounted for this burst of genius? Well, three words. I would suggest three words: independence, prosperity, and Protestantism can explain 17th century Holland. After a long victorious war of independence from Spain, a new ruling class emerges that quickly garners immense riches from its maritime empire. And how did the Dutch spend their newfound wealth? Well, recall that Calvinism, the form of Protestantism prevalent in the North, forbade pretension or ostentation or any form of self-aggrandizement, any sin of pride. So these strict Calvinists couldn't display or consume evidence of their success. You know, they couldn't have landed estates or dress themselves lavishly. The only material objects that flew under the radar were paintings. So they commissioned paintings, and for this few short decades, an entire body of truly brilliant artists arose, wonderfully capable of meeting the challenge. They painted in a new style of realism, referring back to early Netherlandish artists like Jan van Eyck. So, what do they paint? Well, painters turn to art that reflects themselves, that tells them who they are, what they aspire to. Toward this end, artists devised 4 categories of painting, which they either invent, innovate, or elevate. 3 are unique to the Dutch of this period. First, genre art, paintings that celebrate their daily lives. Such art was totally unknown in other countries, an explanation perhaps residing in the Dutch love of their home and the family it shelters. Second, they innovate and breathe life into still lives. The Dutch virtually invented still lives, evidenced by the fact that the English derived the term from the Dutch word still even, things that stand still. Up until then, still lives were mere wall decorations or space keepers. Third, they celebrate landscape, raising it to the status of primary subject matter. Before, it was secondary, a stage setting for actions, but not for the Dutch who love this flat, uninspired and uninspiring landscape. They fought hard for every meter of that land against the Spanish and the sea, and it was a great source of pride. The 4th category is portraits, which of course the Dutch didn't invent, but then there was Rembrandt, with whom we could open and close the discussions. But there's much more to Dutch portraiture than Rembrandt. There's Frans Hals. I'm excited to share with you examples of each of these new styles in our tour today. So let's begin with our earliest work, Death of the Virgin, dating from 1460 to 65 by the artist Petrus Christus. This is one of less than 40 known works of Petrus Christus, who excelled in portraits and religious work. The painting is a stunning example of what's known as Flemish narrative painting, which is designed to inspire its Catholic audience to greater piety by involving them in the drama of the moment. So there's a story here. The apostles prepare to administer extreme unction, or the last anointing, the final sacrament administered at death, to the Virgin, bringing along a container of holy water, a censer, and the Holy Scriptures. The Virgin holds a candle traditionally placed in the hands of the dying as a symbol of Christian faith. She's surrounded by the 12 apostles who, as it's told, she called to be at her death. Scattered throughout the world, they were said to be miraculously transported to her side when she died, hence perhaps the fact that they're not wearing shoes primarily. Depicted in this work is the dormition, or the falling asleep of Mary, and her bodily assumption into heaven. Dormition expresses the belief that Mary died without suffering in a state of spiritual peace. The painting is really so unusual because it shows 3 episodes of the story in one painting, and you're carried around the painting by the movement of the color red, which is carefully dotted around the composition. So on the left, the moment of the Virgin's death She holds a candle which symbolizes that death. Above, the angels bear Mary's soul to heaven, where God the Father welcomes her with open arms. This is the Assumption. Notice here that God has a face. And on the right, the reception of the Virgin's girdle or her belt by St. Thomas, or Doubting Thomas, as proof of the Assumption. Being the artist's largest work suggests it was intended as an altarpiece, likely created for a wealthy patron for use as a devotional object in a private chapel. Petrus Christus combined the jewel-like colors and the light interplay achieved through the Flemish breakthroughs in the use of oil paints and glazing technique. And these techniques, of course, were associated with Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden. And Petrus Christus was the first Flemish artist to utilize the Florentine one-point perspective system of Brunelleschi and Alberti. This work originally was the center panel of a triptych, and unfortunately, the side panels were destroyed during World War II, but we can see how the work would have originally seen. And the image that you see on the right shows you that one-point perspective, which was a breakthrough by Petrus Christus. So here are the images of the two wings, St. John the Baptist on the left and St. Catherine on the right, as the triptych would have originally appeared. The large size of the saints stresses the fact that they're outside the specific context of the scene in the center, and they suggest that they're serving the divine representations of the donor, whomever they may have been. Now, Petrus Christus was quite innovative for his time, and we can see this in our next work, which is Portrait of a Female Donor and Portrait of a Male Donor from about the same time. Now, here are the two panels. While we don't have evidence that these were the two wings of a triptych, but we might piece being an image for devotion. So let's focus on the female donor for a moment. The woman, dressed in sumptuous clothing, kneels at a prie-dieu on which there's an open book. She looks up and presses her hands together in prayer. A shield on the wall bears the arms of the Vivaldi, a Genoese banking family who often did business in the north. A woodcut of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary has been stuck to the wall with red sealing wax, perhaps because she's the woman's namesake. This portrait belongs among the masterworks of early Netherlandish painting, and it marks a new development in Netherlandish portraiture. It no longer shows the sitter in front of a neutral background, but in a concrete space defined by the background wall panels. The unknown woman, whose exquisite clothing suggests she might come from France, radiates an aura of discretion and nobility, while appearing slightly unreal in the elegant stylization of her form. Moving now to the 16th century, we have a work by Peter Bruegel the Elder, considered one of the greatest Flemish Netherlandish painters. More than any other painter, he helped free landscapes from their dependence on religion. In this painting, Bruegel depicts the Bible's parable of the sower. Bruegel had recently returned to Antwerp about 1555, following a 2-year stay in Rome. And this landscape from 1557 is an evocation of scenery he'd seen on his trip. It's an example of what we call, and in quotes, the world landscape composition style that was popular in 16th century Europe. It depicts an imaginary panoramic landscape seen from an elevated viewpoint, which includes all of the most spectacular aspects of European geography. The subject of this style of painting is usually a biblical or historical narrative, but the figures depicted, the narrative element, are always dwarfed by their majestic surroundings in this world landscape panorama. Now, the biblical story here is played out in the foreground at the left, where a humble peasant scatters seeds on rocky soil. Notice the tree stump. The house behind him is lit by morning sun. According to St. Matthew, some seeds fell by the wayside and the small birds devoured them up. Some fell in stony places where they didn't have much earth, and some fell among thorns. But others fell into good ground and they brought forth root. The picture is cut diagonally with a wide river, indicating there are two parts to the story. At the lower right, a dirt path invites us to enter the picture and winds in and out of sight as it descends to the river. On the far bank, a small group of people gather to listen to Jesus deliver his message of salvation. And like the seeds falling on the soil, some won't listen to him, but others will heed his words, and faith will blossom in them. Now, I also want you to notice in the distance, the colors become grayish, bluish, and the images are blurred. And this is what is known as atmospheric perspective. And it, contrasts the object and its background. The contrast decreases as you view something in the distance. Now, what's unique about Bruegel's illustration of the parable of the sower is that it's set within a much wider and vast landscape. We called that the world landscape. It's the relationship between the natural world and the reception of the word of God, which Bruegel shows. We sense the beauty of both. Both parable and painting draw upon the common human task. But the tasks go on within the landscape, and they're part of it. Human living and the natural world influence and shape each other. The town and the church is no doubt built from locally quarried stone. The small boats are perhaps fishing vessels, harvesting the sea and yet subject to its perils. Human hands have laid out fields, planted crops in the hope of a good harvest, cut down trees for firewood, built cottages, and thatched them with straw. And it can all find expression in the sower sowing. Following Peter Bruegel in the 17th century was Jacob van Ruysdael. There was arguably no 17th century artist who captured the flatness and expanse of the Dutch landscape better than van Ruysdael. And we're going to take a look at his work, A View of Haarlem and the Bleaching Fields that was done. First, I just wanted to show you an image of Bruegel, who was considered the greatest Flemish painter of the 16th century. Jacob van Ruysdael learned to paint from his father, who was a frame maker, an art dealer, and a painter, and from his uncle, Solomon van Ruysdael. After studying landscape painting in Germany for 10 years, he settled in Amsterdam, and there he maintained a flourishing painting studio where he trained the next generation of Dutch landscape painters. Little more is known about his life, and as far as is known, there isn't a single portrait, self-portrait, or letter by van Ruysdael. The subject of this painting is the bleaching of clothing and uncut cloth. Next to brewing, bleaching was the most important industry in Haarlem, and the renown of Haarlem bleaching was such that visitors from foreign locales, as well as from the city itself, visited the countryside to see the process in action. Outsiders might have purchased images like this one as souvenirs, but more likely the owners of such paintings were Dutch, for whom the landscape was a point of pride. Now, there are various steps in the bleaching of linen, and it took about 7 months. The sand dunes surrounding Haarlem provided the best linen bleaching conditions in Europe, and the lucrative dairy industry provided the byproduct of buttermilk, which would have been discarded had it not been used for bleaching. At the peak of its prominence, Haarlem was producing some 44,000 cloths each year, and it was called Holland cloth, or simply Holland in England and elsewhere. So it was quite a profitable industry. Haarlem remained an important source of bleached linens for European nations up until the early 18th century. Depicted from a raised vantage point, the landscape occupying the lower third of the canvas is flat and expansive. The artist arranges the buildings and rows of linen to lead the eye diagonally through alternating areas of shadow and light. In contrast to the enormous, puffy, cumulus clouds above, representative of Van Ruysdael's landscapes, the land is marked by carefully plotted fields, tidy houses, and detailed greenery. Sky and earth are separated by a nearly straight horizon line, which is typical of these landscapes. The presence of St. Bavo, the church, on the horizon identifies the city beyond as Haarlem, at the same time suggesting the role of divine providence in the success of the Dutch. Van Ruysdael completed about 15 views of Haarlem with the linen fields, in addition to making 700 paintings and over 100 drawings. He received a medical degree in 1676 and probably pursued a successful second career as a surgeon. And he is buried actually in St. Bavo's. So we've talked about landscapes. Let's now move on to another of the genre associated with the Dutch, and we'll take a look at still life by Peter Clez. Pieter Clez was the foremost still life painter in Haarlem, which was the leading artistic center in 17th century Holland. And his specialty was a new one in a country recently freed from dominance by the aristocracy and the Catholic Church, whose artistic demands had favored grand commissions and devotional images. Clez pioneered the development of the monochrome tabletop still life, and it was called a bankje, the Dutch word, quietly restrained works composed in sober tones, yet imbued with an extraordinary sense of naturalism. Combines two types of still life, one called breakfast pieces or representations of a light meal, and another called smokers' requiems. This is one of Clez's domestic objects present in every Dutch household. So you see a pot of burning charcoals and a pile of tapers for lighting the long clay pipe. Part of what's still fascinating to us today is the amazing way Clez creates a sense of texture for the pewter on the plate, the rough skin of the fish, or the burning coals, almost fluorescent against the dark background. Or notice the translucency of the glass, a wonderful array of things that are so tangible, in the way he handles the paint. Now, the Dutch delight in material goods did extend to collecting paintings, and citizens of all classes wanted visual records of a society which had grown prosperous through their trade. But let's look again and consider the symbolism in this work. The ever-present morality and humility central to the Calvinist faith tempered Dutch pride in worldly goods. As such, the Dutch still life artists often used images of fragility or decay to convey moral messages on the fleeting nature of life, the inevitability of death, and the follies of human vanity. Such works are called vanitas paintings, of which this is an example. So notice the dead herring, in which the scales could indicate souls that are being weighed, the half-empty glass and overturned pitcher, life is fleeting, and the coals, some of which have already burned and turned into ash, a representation again of the fact that life is fleeting. Now, here's another still life by Claes that he painted just the following year, and it's much more dramatic in its vanitas symbols. The overturned glass drained to the very last drop seems to symbolize the briefness of worldly pleasures. The pocket watch is facing away from us and has its back open, as if someone had tried to fathom the mysterious nature of time. Vanitas are closely related to the earlier tradition of memento mori, Latin for remember you must die. These were artworks intended to prompt viewers to consider their mortality. The skull is an example of a memento mori image, and of course it's symbolic of death. But unlike memento mori, vanitas paintings also include other symbols such as musical instruments, wine, and books to remind us explicitly of the futility of worldly pleasures and goods. The tipped over goblet and spilt ink serve a moralizing message on the ephemerality of sensory pleasure. The glass ball is a fascinating and unusual motif. Reflected in its spherical surface is a self-portrait of the artist at his easel. So since he's present in effigy, the artist doesn't need to place his signature on the panel, which consequently becomes a true autobiographical document. The painter is in the picture. The reflection of Claes's self-portrait in his still life may also be understood as a pointer to the fact that every painting conceals more than it reveals in its reflective fragility. The glass ball also recalls a soap bubble, a conventional symbol in still life painting for the fatal frailty of human life. So man is like a soap bubble. I thought it might be fun for you to see that the vanitas theme lives on in contemporary art in a work by Pablo Picasso. Of course, this is Picasso, so you have all angular rhythms, sharp edges, strongly contrasting areas of black and white. This macabre print was made in February 1946 and can be seen as associated with the suffering and the death of the Second World War. The scene depicted is somber and restrained and definitely belongs to the tradition of the 17th century vanitas still lives. The book traditionally alludes to excessive pride through learning, and the wine jug to the transitoriness of worldly pleasures. The skull, as we said, is a memento mori, remembrance of death. Picasso was superstitious about death. He kept a skull in his studio, and he had included human or animal skulls in his work as early as 1908. Now, of course, we could not speak about our Dutch gallery without talking about the museum's Rembrandt, the only painting in San Diego by the most important Dutch artist. And this work from 1657 is entitled Saint Bartholomew. Now, Rembrandt is one of the greatest artists, of course, of all time, and he's acclaimed for his compelling representations of the human condition. He is known for capturing the inner life and feelings of his subjects. Known primarily for his portraits and landscapes, he remained interested throughout his life in history and biblical painting, turning repeatedly to the Bible as a source of inspiration. Despite the considerable wealth and notoriety that Rembrandt had achieved early in his career, the late 1650s was an extremely difficult time for him. His beloved first wife, Saskia, had passed away, and his housekeeper had borne a child out of wedlock, bringing great criticism. When she died, Rembrandt remarried Hendrik to help care, the woman he had hired to help care for his son Titus. His commissions declined, and he lost money in speculative investments, forcing him into bankruptcy in order to avoid imprisonment. All of his goods, including an impressive collection of paintings, were sold off, and he had to move to a much poorer district of town. Among the works Rembrandt did during this dark period in his life was this portrait of the Apostle Saint Bartholomew, one of the disciples of Christ. Flayed alive for his beliefs, he's holding in his right hand a butcher's knife, the symbol or attribute of his martyrdom. Rembrandt's portrayal of a relatively youthful man with rugged features reflects his own vision of biblical figures as unidealized, real people who walk the earth with passions and beliefs, fears and anxieties, similar to those felt by the rest of humanity. Here, St. Bartholomew leans slightly forward in a low back chair. His gaze is averted to the viewer's left. His eyebrow is cocked. Strong light brilliantly illuminates the right side of his face, revealing his hollow cheek and furrowed brow. His expression is of deep thought, suggesting he might be contemplating his own demise. He's dressed in a plain brown robe over a white shirt, the cuff of which in white. A heavier colored cloak covers the chair. And notice Rembrandt's celebration of texture through the impasto technique of applying thick layers of paint. We see this around his face, reinforcing the furrowed brow and his contemplative expression, and we also see it with the burst of white at his cuff. Rembrandt created a very different depiction of Saint Bartholomew in another work done 4 years later. This was done just 8 years before his death, and the painting depicts Saint Bartholomew also holding a knife in his right hand, but here it's pointing up, also pointing up. One of Rembrandt's neighbors may have posed as the model for the saint. But unlike our work, here Rembrandt shows the apostle as a common man, giving the revered holy figure a tangible human quality, suggesting perhaps that holiness is part of daily life, a view in keeping with the religious atmosphere of mid-1600 Amsterdam. Similar to our work, Saint Bartholomew appears pensive, almost melancholy. He holds his chin as if lost in thought, and his eyes seem to see beyond time. Again, similar to our work, Rembrandt used a broader, freely brushed technique typical of his late mature style. Applied with a palette knife, thick areas of impasto again are visible on the saint's forehead, nose, ears, and hands. The overall handling of paint is much more expressive and contrasts with the smoother, more precise style of his earlier works. Now, coincident with Rembrandt's time is Anthony van Dyck, and here is his portrait of Mary Villiers, Lady Herbert of Sherlin, from 1636. Anthony van Dyck was a Flemish Baroque artist born in Antwerp to a wealthy silk merchant. And he was a very talented, precocious youth who started his training at age 10, and he became an independent artist when he was 16. He was the most important assistant of the leading Northern painter of the day, who of course was Peter Paul Rubens. And while he never surpassed Rubens in terms of popularity, he achieved international fame with his work, and primarily his portraits of the nobility and wealthy. In 1632, Van Dyck was invited to the court of King Charles and Queen Henrietta Maria of England. That same year, he was knighted by Charles I, and he was made their Majesty's principal court painter. Charles has commissioned numerous portraits from Van Dyck, not only for members of his own family, but also for foreign friends and ambassadors. Mary Villiers was raised in the royal household, where she enjoyed the status of a princess. Her father, who worked for the king, had been assassinated. Charles I arranged for her marriage at age 12 to Charles Lord Herbert, then 15, the oldest son of Lord Pembroke, a man of considerable fortune and one of Van Dyck's earliest patrons. Tragically, Lord Herbert died of smallpox just 2 years later, in 1636, which is when this portrait was commissioned by Charles. His initials are on the back of the painting, and it hung in Charles I's collection. Though Mary was only 14 years old at the time of this work, she emerges from the plain, dark background in dignified splendor, pointing to one of the black ribbons that suggests her recent widowhood. Heavy pearls gleam at her ears and neck, and she wears the latest fashion, a glowing low-cut taffeta gown trimmed with silvery lace. Her calm, dispassionate gaze, like her pale skin, signify aristocratic refinement. And of course, also a sign of recent death of her husband is the wilted flower that she's carrying. So a question, did Lady Villiers borrow Queen Henrietta Maria's pearls? Well, later known as the Mancini pearls, they still survive today. And here's Van Dyck's portrait of Queen Henrietta Maria of England, also done at the same year, wearing a similar dress with the same black ribbon for mourning and perhaps the same pearls around her neck and earrings. Sadly, Lady Mary Villiers' string of losses didn't end with the death of her father and her first husband. 2 subsequent husbands predeceased her, as did both her children. At age 10, a son, and age 18, a daughter. In the 17th century, demand for portraits was greater than for any other type of work, and everyone wanted to be painted by Van Dyck. He was one of the first fashionable portrait painters, able to give an appearance of refined elegance to subjects who lacked those qualities. And he was quite a flamboyant character himself, always wearing a sunflower because it was greatly admired by Charles I. Here's a very well-known self-portrait, which nicely depicts the artist's personality. Van Dyck spent the remainder of his life in the British court. He received a quiet house of his own, along with a handsome pension of £200 annually from the court. And he was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, quite an indication of his standing at the time of his death. He did transform British portraiture by banishing the stiff Tudor and Jacobean images and developing his distinctive, fluid, shimmering style that came to dominate portraiture in Britain until the early 20th century. You could just feel the textures of his fabrics. Now, we cannot consider, of course, 17th century Dutch portraitists without including Frans Hals, to whom we now turn. This portrait depicts a middle-aged man, age 48, and we know that because of the inscription which appears prominently in the upper right part of the painting above the date, and we see Hals' own initial there. Painted in the same year is the pendant painting to our work at the Detroit Institute of Art. We see similar coloration and dress, and the size of the panels are the same. Our sitter has a slightly florid complexion, thinning brown hair, a light brown, pointed, very stylish beard. His hand is raised to his chest, pointed upward to perhaps bring our attention to his face. He's dressed in the black regent robe of a governor, with a black mantle over his left shoulder and a large white ruff or collar. The subject glances at the viewer in a spontaneous manner, appearing to be a jolly and affable fellow. His crinkly eyes and a small smile makes us think he's going to break into a broader smile or talk to us. And notice the spectacular detail of the collar, a similar one worn by his wife. Almost transparent, it appears to reflect light to the sitter's face. This round and flat variation is often called a millstone collar, after its resemblance to that object. The collar's stiffness forced upright posture, and their impracticality led them to become a symbol of wealth and status. The bigger the collar, the better. A sign of Hall's skill is that he painted this intricate collar directly on the canvas. There's no underlying drawing. Now, included in the Timken collection is a different type of portrait by Paul Rubens. This bust-length picture of a handsome, curly-haired young man in contemporary armor with a red sash artfully draped across his shoulder was painted by Peter Paul Rubens in 1620. And by the 1620s, Rubens was recognized as the foremost painter of decorative projects outside Italy, such as altarpieces and ceiling paintings for churches. And of course, he also produced portraits and mythological and biblical pictures for private patrons. This work has traditionally been identified as a young captain, but it's almost certainly a work of practice, which is called a tronie, and that's the Dutch word meaning face, or modelli in Italian. It's a preparatory study or drawing that was used for reference by the artist or his workshop assistants in the painting of other works. So they're portraits of living but intentionally anonymous models, which reveal interest in the character types. A modelli was considered the purest representation of the artist's invention. So tronies are not portraits. They weren't made in order to produce the best possible likeness of an individual. Although there would, as I say, probably be a sitter, the point of a tronie was mainly to make a study of a head representing a particular character type. Rembrandt had popularized tronies in Dutch art around 1630, and he made dozens of them, often using himself as the model. Many of those portraits you know by Rembrandt with the beret are tronies. This work is a brilliant example of Rubens' virtuoso technique. He was extraordinarily accomplished in his ability to achieve with speed and efficiency the image he wanted to create. It's a tour de force of painting, accomplishing and animation and excitement it can only do if you paint rapidly. Now, it's hard to talk about tronies without addressing, even briefly, what's probably the most famous trony of all. It's a work by Vermeer, and I expect you all know the painting I'm referring to. Girl with a Pearl Earring from 1665. In this work, a young woman looks over her shoulder at us. She holds her head slightly to one side and she has a gleam in her grayish blue eyes. On her head is a turban that she's wound from two pieces of material, one blue, one yellow. Now note that 17th century Dutch girls did not wear turbans. With this accessory, Vermeer has given the girl an oriental air. And of course, she's adorned with a pearl earring. The pearl is too large to be real. Perhaps she's wearing a pearl drop made of glass, which has been varnished to give it a matte sheen. Another possibility is that the pearl was a product of Vermeer's imagination. Pearls were fashionable in this time period, and we often find them in paintings of other Dutch artists of this period. We saw them, of course, in Mary Villiers' work. The painting provides a rich sample of every aspect of Vermeer's virtuoso technique. The face is modeled very softly, not in great detail, but gradual transitions and invisible brushstrokes. The clothing is depicted more schematically and enlivened with small dots of paint, suggesting reflected light, one of Vermeer's trademark features. Even so, the artist has indicated differences between materials. For example, the white collar painted in impasto and the drier paint of the turban, for which he used the precious pigment ultramarine. But the most remarkable detail is the pearl, which consists of little more than two brushstrokes, a bright highlight at upper left and the soft reflection of the white collar on the underside. We'll close today with a tiny gem, a genre work in the Dutch Flemish gallery entitled Lady Receiving a Letter by Gabriel Metsu. Writing letters had become fashionable in Europe in the 17th century after the establishment of a postal system. And in the Dutch Republic, education was strongly emphasized, and the population was quite literate at an earlier date than other European countries. And as such, they developed the first system of mail. Unlike today, the recipient, not the sender, paid the postage. So you had a lot of postage that was unclaimed, a lot of letters unclaimed. And the Netherlandish people loved writing letters. We know that the secretary to the Prince of Orange wrote 80,000 letters in his lifetime. This love of letters brings us to this small work, a scene from everyday life. The Timken show setting, framed by the arch and Palladian villa in the distance, conveying elegance and wealth. The delivery of a letter by a messenger, and we know he's a messenger because of his black hat, appears to have interrupted the young woman, who sits at an open book, perhaps a Bible, in her lap. As to the identity of the letter writer, art historians are quite certain that the gentleman in another Metsu painting, entitled A Man Writing a Letter, is the man in question. And this work is now in the collection of the Musée Fabre Montpellier in France. There's persuasive evidence that this other work shown here is the pendant painting. Their comparable size and complementary 3/4 length format support the assumption that Metsu conceived them as pendants or companion pieces. And they were done, of course, at about the same time. And they also include, each one includes a second person in the image. Now, note pair in 314, 15, and 1880. According to a leading scholar of Metsu's work, Metsu represented himself as the man in the Montpellier painting and his wife, Isabella, as the model for the Timken's work. This brings our tour to a close. I hope you've enjoyed this whirlwind tour with Rembrandt and his colleagues and look forward to any comments or questions you may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Eleanor. And now we'll open it up if anybody has any questions. Oh, and feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself to ask the question.
I saw Becky's hand up. Becky, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sorry. Hi, Eleanor.
Hi, Becky.
I just was going to ask you, you mentioned the word memento mori.
Mori.
And could you define that one more time? I didn't catch
Yeah,
it.
it's a symbol of death. So the skull, of course, is the obvious item that we consider a memento mori. So those of you familiar with the Timken collection might know the work by Zurbarán, the Spanish artist, Baroque artist, and we have an image of him holding a skull, and
Yes.
that's, a memento mori. So very often you see images of memento mori in a vanitas painting.
I see.
So a unlit candle, a candle that's been extinguished, would be a memento mori. Very often in Dutch works of this time, you see a lemon that's being peeled on the edge of a table. That's memento mori. Charcoal's burning, all of those items.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
It was an
certainly.
excellent talk.
Thank
I
you,
was
Becky.
wondering if the Timken actually is it only paintings that's in the Timken collection, or does the Timken hold any sort of instruments? Like, for example, the artist's easels or any of the paintbrushes that they use, or perhaps even musical instruments?
Do we have any of those objects? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, does the Timken hold any?
No, our collection is solely paintings. Actually, we have one sculpture, but yeah, the art objects are not part of the collection, sadly.
It's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, it would be fun.
And one more question, but with regards to the development of perspective, I was wondering if this was it in this particular group of artists that had begun to do that, or had it become earlier, or had it the idea of perspective been?
Well, perspective was begun by Brunelleschi, the architect in Italy in about the 1400s, but it was introduced, we noted that Petrus Christus was the first one who introduced it in Northern Europe, in the Netherlands. In the, Petrus Christus' work was the 1450 something, but it started in Italy with Brunelleschi.
Right, of course. Okay, thank you so much for the clarification.
You're welcome. Appreciate your participation.
All right, and it looks like we have a comment in the chat from Stefan who says, very interesting. I'm Dutch and it's wonderful to hear more about the meanings within paintings of our great masters. Great job.
Oh, how wonderful. Thank you. I'm sure I could learn a great deal more from you. I visited, I don't know how many of you have been to Amsterdam. It's such a wonderful city, and the Rijks Rijksmuseum is,
Yeah.
you could spend quite a number of days in that wonderful museum.
Yeah, it's an amazing place. No, thank you very
Yes.
much. This was very, very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and then I will also go ahead and announce our next talk is going to happen on Thursday, December 22nd. It's going to be a free virtual talk titled The Spanish Baroque, Murillo Velázquez, Zurbarán, and Beyond. And if anyone would like to know more about our upcoming events, please feel free to check out the events page on our website. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again for our next virtual talk.
Wonderful. Thank you very
Thank
much.
Everyone, thank you.
Hi, everyone.